morning. Thank you for joining us today. As always, we are grateful for the time that we get to connect with you via these webinars. I know I see a lot of familiar names in here, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Bruce Anthony, and I am one of the trainers with Service Technologies. Now, before we get started, I wanted to point out that I have several colleagues on the call today who will be able to answer your questions via the chat function. So please feel free to ask away throughout the webinar. They will answer your questions directly, and they'll also pass along questions to me that they think will be helpful for the entire group. I also want to note that if you have to leave before you receive a response, our customer support team will reach out to you after the webinar. So in this month's webinar, we'll be covering or overviewing the topic of group management. By the end of our time, you will have the tools you need to address many different scenarios using groups to aid in your workflow. So we'll talk about how to create groups, either manually or by using the group request form to collect that information directly. We'll address what features a group contact has access to. After that, we'll look at how to use a group for bulk registrations or reservations. And then finally, we'll go over what reporting options are available for groups specifically. So the first thing to do is kind of define our terms. In groups, or in service, groups are used to represent one of either two types of interactions. One would be an external organization that's working with you, maybe a club, a church, a community group, a school group, something like that. So kind of like an external organization that's engaging with you. The other way to use groups is internally. So if you have a list of, your star volunteers or a subset of volunteers within your organization that you want to identify, you can use groups in either of those sorts of scenarios. Really, they're a tool for grouping volunteers together in a manner that allows you to run searches, run reports, create some metrics, and then also use some tools to manage registrations. So creating a group can be done in a couple different manners. The simplest way is just for you to create a group manually from the admin side of the system. If you go under Attribute Management into the Group Management heading, at the top of this page, under Standard Options, there's an item to add a new group. When we click into Add a New Group here, you can identify what the name of the group is. So if it's a school group or whatever it is, put the name of that in here. This can potentially be visible to volunteers, although not necessarily. The group contact is your point of contact. Now you can list yourself here. That's completely fine in some scenarios, especially if it's like an internal group or a scenario where you don't know who the point of contact is. But if you do have someone who's engaging with you, it's best to put that person in here. Now, if you look for someone through here and you don't see them, that means they don't already have an account. So you would need to create one for them. And you can do so on the right-hand side using the Add Volunteer Profile icon. So this just pops up an Add Volunteer menu. You can quickly make an account for someone. As a reminder, at a minimum, when you as an admin are creating a profile for someone to use later, you need to provide last name, first name, primary phone, and email. Email's not technically required, but that's what allows that person to log into their profile to engage that account. Now, when you're creating a group contact, you can define different access levels. So in Service, there are 5 different access levels, and we'll actually be addressing these specifically in our webinar next month. But today I just want to talk briefly about volunteers versus group leaders. So volunteer is kind of the basic, that's the default access level. Everyone is a volunteer unless you choose to give them higher access. And by default, a volunteer really only has access to their own account information with some exceptions. If they share a phone number or an email address with another volunteer, that might link their accounts. Kind of like family members, essentially. But also, if you list someone as a contact for a group and they have volunteer access, they would still be able to register their group members for events. So they do have some capabilities in that sense, but it's fairly limited. They're not able to manage their profiles. They're just managing some registrations for those individuals. But if you give a group contact group leader access, then that's quite a bit more information that they have access to for their group specifically. This person would then have the ability to view and manage all of the members of their group. So they can view their profiles in Service using the same volunteer management menu that you would use as an admin. Of course, they're limited to their group, but they can engage those accounts, make changes to those profiles, send out emails, run searches, run reports, do registrations for their group members. So they have quite a bit more access if you do choose to give them that group leader level. So that's true for both the primary contact as well as the alternate contact. They both serve the exact same functionality. It's just if you need to have a secondary person, you could choose to use an alternate contact. Group type is either public or private. A public-facing group is something that volunteers can potentially add themselves to if you have groups on your application. So if you don't have groups on your application at all, then that doesn't really affect your volunteers too much. But in general, I would think of this, if you do want volunteers to be able to add themselves to this group, make it public. If you want it to be something where you have to add people or they get added via some kind of automated mechanic, like using a reservation code, something that the volunteers can't necessarily just pick to add themselves to this group, that's when you might make this private. Private groups, of course, are searchable and reportable in the same manner, but volunteers can't self-select this or view this on their profile. The group status is either active or inactive, and of course, when you're creating a new group, this should be active. When a group is done working with you, let's say a corporation moves away, dissolves, something like that, they're no longer engaging with you, you could mark them as inactive, and then that will prevent them from showing up in certain searches. Like when you're adding an associated group to an event or to a reservation code, inactive groups are ignored in those cases. You can still run reports on them in the same manner, still run searches, so you're not losing any legacy data there. But it's just kind of a nice way to indicate that they're no longer actively engaging with you. And then notes are just that. They're notes about the group itself. Generally, these are only visible to administrators and leadership team. Your group contacts can't necessarily see these notes. That said, there is a setting in the system configuration to give group contacts the ability to manage from the group dashboard, in which case they would be able to see those notes. But by default, that setting is off. And so if you're adding notes to a group, that's not something that the group contact can necessarily see. But this would just contain, data about the group itself. It is timestamped in a similar manner as volunteer notes. And then these are also searchable. One last attribute about groups that I want to mention real quick is that once you've created a group, you can add tags to it. So just like on the volunteer side and the opportunity side of the system, you can add tags. And these tags can be used to run searches. So you can have like subsets of groups. Like if you want to list out all of the school groups, you could identify them using a tag. And then you can run searches on those sets of groups, email all of those contacts for those types of groups. So it's just kind of a nice way for you to categorize your groups, and then use that to run searches, run reports, send emails, things like that. We do have an entire webinar about the topic of tags specifically, so if you have questions about that, feel free to ask those in the chat. We can dive into this more, but there is a webinar on that topic specifically. Okay, and then actually one last thing I want to mention too about groups is that you can identify the creation date of the group as long as it was post January 1st, 2021. So when you mouse over the Manage Group icon for a particular group, once it's been built into the system, you can see the date that group was created. Again, if it's past January 1st, 2021, just based on when that feature was added into the system. That's something that you can also filter by. You can, using the advanced options here, search for groups within a certain creation date range. So if you want to see all the groups made within a certain month or a couple months or something like that, you can run a search for those groups. And then that's also something that's exported. And we'll talk about reporting later, but that's a part of the group spreadsheet as well. Okay, so we've looked at one method of creating a group, and that would just be directly doing so from the admin side of the system. Another way to have groups added into your system is by the group contacts themselves filling out what's called the group request form. And the group request form can look something like this, and there is some variation in terms of how this looks because you have control over an intro text field for this request form. So you can add special instructions to the top of the page if you want to, and you can also modify some of the questions in here. But in general, you're basically just collecting the group's name, the contact person who's filling this out, and then some additional information about the group, whether that's the type of group that it is, if it's how often they want to work with you, their participation level, their approximate group size, and then maybe some comments. And again, these questions down here, there's room for variation. These are edited in the system configuration. So the comment section will always be there. The contact person and the group name will always be there, but then these questions that you're asking on the form is something that you can modify. And that's done in the system configuration. So let's take a look at that real quick. So if you go under System Management to edit system configuration, there is a section specifically for group management settings. And if we open that up, I want to point out right off the bat, we already talked about this, allow group leaders to access group management. This is set to no by default. If you change that to yes, again, that would be that scenario where the group contacts could see those notes. But if we move down, you can see the group request form is below that. And if this is turned on, then you'll have access to that form. You can link it on your website. It could be a part of the process, when people are creating accounts with you. You could have, groups click here to make a profile, individuals click here. You can kind of decide what that workflow looks like. But you have to enable this first and then choose a point of contact on your staff who's going to be emailed or notified in service whenever this is filled out. And then below that is the notes or instructions section. So if you do want to add special notes or special instructions to the top of that form, you can. And then below that are the 4 questions that can be a part of that form. So you can see the desired group participation level question that I had, the approximate group size. Those are already listed here. And then there's 2 other questions that can be utilized. There's different ways to use these. You can ask for a line of text or a larger text box. The selection box option allows you to create your own drop-down menus. So you've probably seen these throughout service in a number of different places, but you just put your options in there separated by commas. Left to right will sort top to bottom in that drop-down menu. So if we look at this question on the form itself, it's producing these options here. So when this form is filled out by a group contact, that will produce a follow-up in service. So on the main dashboard, under Volunteer Management, you have View and Manage Volunteer Follow-ups. In this menu, you'll see a lot of different items, potentially, if you have those turned on, and you can also create follow-ups through here. But you can see that group requests are filled out in here as well. So you can see who filled out the form. So if they didn't already have an account, it would make one for them. If they did have an account, it would just link this to their profile. And then on the right-hand side is all the information from the form itself. So in here, there's actually an option to click to create a group. What that will do is take all the information from the form and fill it into that add new group menu that we looked at previously. So it kind of auto-fills or auto-populates that information. And of course, you can change things. So if you need to change the name or who the contact is or whatever, you can change any of those items. But it auto-fills that information, and you can quickly just add that group into the system. All right, so that's creating groups into the system. The next kind of point of information in terms of how a group engages with you is what type of registration or reservation you want to use to engage with that group. So it's best to go through this using kind of an example. So for example, let's say I have Ronald Campbell from Boy Scout Troop 103 contact me, and he wants to bring 30 volunteers to an event. There's a couple different ways that I can engage that specifically. One would be utilizing what's called a bulk registration. So from this menu, I could click into register this group for an opportunity. So of course they have to exist already. But once I've created the group, click on register here using that calendar icon. At the top of the page, I can pick the event that I want to register this group for, enter in how many people are going to be there, and then click on register. So that type of registration, in this case, I'm actually overriding the number of spots available. So that's why it's asking me here if I want to exceed that. I can click on complete registration. But in this scenario, I've registered 30 participants. I don't know who any of those 30 people are. They do not necessarily have accounts with me. And even if they do already have accounts with me, they're not getting individual credit. The credit is going specifically to this group. So in this scenario, it's best used if you don't need to or don't want to identify the individuals who are engaging with you. A lot of times that might be something like a school group where it's a bunch of minors and you don't need them to make their own profiles. Or if it's just a scenario where you just want to know how many people are going to be there, and you don't necessarily need them to create a profile. You don't need them to sign your terms and conditions. You just want them, you just want to be able to identify, hey, we have 30 people who are going to be at this event from this group. And if that's the case, you're pretty much done at this point. You can choose to send out the confirmation email through here if you want the organizer or the contact for this group to receive a notification. But other than that, you are essentially done with this engagement. If, however, you do want to identify who those 30 participants are, you want them to create their own profiles, you need them to sign your terms and conditions, you want to be able to engage those volunteers independently, then you would not do this type of registration. So I'm going to remove this. And if instead I want to identify who those 30 volunteers are, what I will do is utilize reservations. So under the Opportunity Management heading is Reservation Management. And in this menu, you can create a reservation code or reuse an existing code. You don't always have to create a new code if it's a group that's worked with you in the past. But under standard options here, I need to make a new one for this group. So I'll click on Add New Reservation. You can enter in the code to be whatever you want it to be. This is essentially how that information is accessed. Volunteers can see this code. You could tell them to use this code, but you can also send them a direct link, which is typically the easier way to have volunteers engage that. But the code itself, I usually make it something that's legible. So if someone does stumble across it, they kind of understand what it's for. The description, this is for you. So if you want to put in a reminder of why you're making this, who it's for, I usually use the group name in that scenario, but it could represent something different. The reservation contact person has access to see who has used this code, and they will be someone who gets notified or emailed when you choose to send out that email link for this code. But otherwise, they're not really granted extra access to utilizing this code or anything like that. The group association here is important. This means that anyone who uses this code will automatically get added into that group if they were not already a part of it. So this is kind of a really important piece of identifying that with the reservation code. It ties those two things together, and it sort of auto manages the members of that group, to add people in automatically when they do use that link. And then down below that is a reservation expiration. Let's say you've told this group that they have until 2 days prior to the event to fill those slots. Otherwise, they're going to open up. You can actually set that when you create the reservation code. So 2 days prior to any reservation on this code, it will release all the remaining reservations. So let's say I did reserve 30 spots and I told them, hey, you have until 2 days before the event. Otherwise, it's going to release and people on the wait list will get signed up. You could set that and basically have that happen manually or automatically. You can choose to manually manage some of that stuff as well, but this is really useful if you do have kind of like those deadlines and you want to free it open to the public. So once I create a reservation like this, all I've done is I've created the code. I now need to actually manage a reservation and create some saved spots using that code. So I could click here to go directly into manage the reservation. That's the easiest way if you're just going from one to the next. But I do also want to show you from the main reservation dashboard, you can click into manage a reservation through here. So on the left-hand side, there's a manage reservation code option. And if I click into that menu, in here, I can do sort of what we did earlier, select my event, enter in the number of spots to save, and then assign that to the reservation. Now, something important to note about reservations is that they cannot exceed the number of spots available on the event. So earlier I mentioned we were kind of exceeding that using the group registration, and I had permission to do that as an admin. But for a reservation, I can't do that because volunteers wouldn't be allowed to exceed, the number of spots available. So there's only 24 spots left in this event. I can either fill in all 24 of those, or if I want to do more, I would need to go into the event and expand the number of spots available. But once you create a reservation like this, now these spots are set aside for this group. The only people who can access those spots are individuals who either know what the code is, so they could go in and type Troop 103 as the reservation, or people to whom I send a direct reservation code link. So these have been set aside for the group, and remember, anyone who uses this reservation code will then get added into that group as well. So for reporting purposes, That's pretty neat and tidy. You can easily identify those individuals. And then you can also run reports based on reservation code usage specifically. So if I only want to see the hours that were accrued utilizing this reservation code specifically, that is something you can do via reporting. Okay, so once we've made the reservation, the next really big step is actually sending that out to your volunteers so that they can engage with those reserved spots. So if we look back on the main reservation dashboard, from here we have a couple links or a couple more icons associated with this code. The first one is a reservation code link, and if we grab that, there's two versions. They both do the exact same thing. So if you're going to be sending this link out directly, I usually use this shortened link. And you can just use this clipboard icon to copy that. There's also QR code versions of these. This just generates a QR code, which you could then right click and save if you're doing like a flyer or something that you want volunteers to scan to sign up for those saved positions. This can be really useful. So this QR code will take someone directly to the registration page or the event listing page and have that reservation code automatically applied. So they will only see the spots that were set aside for them. But I copied that link, and if we go and I'm going to log out real quick, and if we go to that link, it will take us directly to the event listing page, and you can see that it automatically applied that code. So the only thing that we're seeing here are the spots that were saved using that code. And again, I could then go and sign up. From here, the steps for registration from the volunteer's perspective are identical to any other registration process for volunteers. There's nothing special they need to know. This is basically just filtering the page for them so they can see the spots that were set aside for them, and then they can click in to register for those events. So they can just follow the standard prompts. They click on the event. Down here at the bottom, they click to register. If they were already logged in previously, it'll remember them. Otherwise, they'll go to an account check page. They'll type in their information here. If that matches an account, they'll be asked for their password. If it doesn't match an account, they'll be asked to create a profile. And once they've done that, they'll complete their registration, and they're basically just filling in one of those reserved spots. So it's a pretty straightforward process from that point. And that link is really useful because you're just sending someone directly to, the page where you're seeing only the events that were set aside for them. One other thing that you can do with reservation codes is you can apply an image to a reservation code. And what that can be useful for is if you have like a corporate partner, you could have their logo in there so that when you send them this link, they see their logo. And so it kind of fits in as like a landing page for them. It helps them sort of identify that they are in the right place. To attach an image like this, all you need to do is when you create a reservation code, if we go back into Reservation Management, select the link or the image icon next to the code itself, and then you can attach an image through here. Okay, something very important to note about the accessibility that group contacts have in regards to registrations and reservations, like what we just went through. Everything I showed you was done kind of from the admin side of the system. You can give your group contacts those same sorts of permissions. So if you would like to give your group contacts the ability to create their own reservations or to create their own bulk registrations, you can do that. There is a setting for that in the system configuration. So in the edit system configuration, in the group management settings, at the bottom of that section, we'll see allow group self-registration. The default for this is no, which means group contacts do not have permission to do bulk registrations or reservations, but you can give them permission to do one or the other. And there's really 4 other settings in here. So there's yes, reserve only, yes, register only, yes, create and register, and yes, create and reserve. The create and options would allow any volunteer in your system to both create a group and then also complete either a bulk registration or a reservation in one step. So it's a pretty loose setting in the sense that it gives every volunteer in the system the ability to function as a group. For example, I could just go in and sign up as Bruce's family and say that I'm signing up 10 people. And depending on what you have selected, bulk register or reserve, if you do register, then you wouldn't know who any of those 10 people are. I just done a bulk registration. If I do reserve, it creates a reservation code, and then that will email the person who created it and tell them to distribute that code so that the volunteers themselves will sign up and actually fill in those positions. But again, if you do the create and option, it's pretty loose in the sense that any person can take that action. If you do yes reserve only or register only, in my system I have it set to yes reserve only. That means that you have to create the group first from the admin side of Service, whether you use the group request form or just manually build it in. But then once a group contact has been added in, whether they are a volunteer or a group leader, so it doesn't matter what their access level is, then they would be able to do either a reservation or a registration. So again, with mine set to reserve only, as it is currently, you'll see when someone goes to our events, they'll see register as a volunteer and also register as a group. Now, the register as a group button is only relevant for people who are already in charge of a group. So if someone clicks on that and they log in and they are not in charge of a group, then they won't have the ability to do this. But if they are, like I am in this case, I can select my group and then I could do a reservation. And so again, I'd be setting aside, however many spots. I get an email and then I am told to email that or forward that on to the people who need to sign up. So that's a pretty important note, is that you can allow your group contacts to take those sorts of actions. But it's not something that they have by default. It is something that you would need to turn on. So one more management item that I want to mention about groups is that when you are creating a group, you can also attach documents to a group. So if you want to say, this is a form for this group, something like that, you'll see that paperclip icon once you've attached a document. And if we go into manage the groups, we can also see that through here. There's a view and update file attachment section. Once you've attached a document through here, you can choose to post it. So if you click on this icon here, that will post the document, meaning any person who is a member of this group will now be able to see this when they log into their account. So if we switch over to the volunteer perspective now, there is a section for viewing posted documents when a volunteer logs into their account. And if they open this up, they'll be able to see any documents that have been posted for them. So I can see this group one because I'm a member of that group and I can go and download that if I need to. Volunteers will also see their most recent signed terms and conditions here. But this is really helpful if you have like a document that you need to send out to a certain group. Of course, you can grab links to those as well. If we go back into that file management section, I could grab a link to this document from here and send that out to volunteers. That's done through file management. But this is really useful. You could just tell them to go and log in and download that document. Okay. So the last kind of major aspect of groups is reporting. And there's a number of different ways that you can report on groups themselves. Some of that is done through the group management portal. In this section, I can search for a set of groups, right? I can search by the group name, the contact name. I can search by notes, keywords within those, or I can search by tags. There's also down here searching for groups by creation date, or a couple other kind of quick actions like searching for private groups or active groups, things like that. But once you've run a search for a group, or if you want to view everything, you can select those groups here, and then there's a group spreadsheet. This is basically just pulling information about the group, including things like the creation date, the group contact, all that sort of information. So this is just like a spreadsheet export of group information. The other reporting options for groups are going to be found in report management. So there's two that I want to point out specifically. The first one that I want to mention is number 4. So on this report, on this page, you have group participation report. This uses the date range at the top of the page. So you're going to see all the hours served by that group and members of that group within a time frame. You can search for a group by name here, or you could view all your groups by leaving that blank. You can also quickly enter in a keyword search for group names or group tags, but then you can basically just run a report for your groups. Again, this will show you the volunteers within that group, based on information that or registrations that those volunteers had. So if you want to see like everything that all the members of a certain group did within a time frame, this is a useful report for that. The other report that I want to mention is the custom participation report, and that's because this is more flexible. This allows you to run reports in a lot of different scenarios. But more specifically, I just want to point out that you can search for a subset of groups. So if we are in attributes, if we're in group management and I run a search for a set of groups using a tag or something, I can then come back here and say, use my previous group search. So only those groups will show up in the report. And then again, I can set a date range and select how much information I want from volunteer profiles or from the events themselves. One other aspect of that I mentioned earlier is that you can search for specific reservation code usage as well. So you could say, I want to see, any activity from any person, but I only want to see if someone used a particular reservation code. So I could go over here and search for, a reservation code by name. So I'm only looking at one reservation code, or I could search for multiple. I can search by associated group or contact, different things like that. But once I run a search here, I can go back into report management and say, I want to use my previous reservation search as the kind of query or criteria for this report. So this is a much more limited report in a sense, in terms of how much data it's bringing back to you, but that can be a really useful thing because now I'm only seeing the activity from those reservation codes, and that could be spread across a bunch of different events, but it's only the people who use that reservation code, in those instances. All right, so we went through a lot of information today in terms of creating and engaging groups. We're going to move into a Q&A time here. Our team has been answering questions throughout the call, but I'll be taking some more of those as they come in. So feel free to continue writing in your questions. We're just going to be doing Q&A for the rest of the time here. So a question did come in asking, do reservation codes work for specific assignments or time slots within an event? That's a great question. The answer is yes. When you create a reservation, you are reserving spots for a specific shift. So if you're reserving spots, like I did earlier, I was reserving spots in a normal event. This is an event happening on May 25th at 8 a.m. I just identified the number of people that I was setting aside as spots for. But if I'm reserving spots within a time slot event, you'll see it'll say various time slots here. And then I can enter in, how many spots I want to save, click on assign, and then it'll bring me to another menu where I choose which time slots I want to save those spots in. And you can actually do this for multiple shifts at the same time. So I could say I want to save 5 spots, on a couple different Mondays upcoming, and then I could go and select those different Mondays. And then once I've made those selections here, then down at the bottom, I can click on assign to the reservation. And you'll see each of those instances. They're all in the sort and repack event, but they're different time slots. Yeah, very good question. So those reservations are on a per shift basis, whether it's time slots or normal events. And then you will also see those in the events themselves. So let me just point that out real quick. If we go into the sort and repack event, I'm just going to click on the name of the event here. That takes us to kind of the management page for that event. If I go into view the registered volunteers or groups, from here, I'll be able to see at the top what reservation codes are being employed in this particular event. And I can actually adjust those through here as well. I didn't show these icons earlier, but if you click on the arrow icons here, you can increase or decrease the number of spots that are being saved using that code. You can do that through here as well as through the reservation management side of things. And then if we scroll down through the event, you can also see when a reservation code has been used. There's a separate column for that. So you can identify individuals that used particular reservations. And if there are reservations on a time slot, it'll tell you how many spots have been reserved. So again, these are not accessible to the public. From the public's point of view, this time slot on May 24th only has one available position remaining, unless you know what the reservation code is, because there's 4 people currently registered. There's 3 unused reservations, so that'd be 7. So there's 1 extra spot that the general public has access to. Okay, so another question came in about just the configuration settings for the group options that we talked about. And that's going to be in the same place where all of your general configuration settings are, and that's the system configuration. So under System Management, go into Edit System Configuration, and we've been talking a lot specifically about groups today. There's a Group Management section, so you can open that up. And then within here, you'll see all the different things that we had talked about. Okay, and that looks like that's all the questions for the general group. Of course, if you have more questions as you yourself are engaging this topic or as you're engaging with your volunteers, and please feel free to contact our support directly. Whenever you're logged into your account, you'll see at the bottom of the page this Need Help button. If you click on that, you can type in a topic through here. There's a lot of articles and videos on different things. But regardless what you've searched for, you can always click on Contact Us at the bottom and submit a support request through there. Our customer support team is very prompt. You can contact them at any time. They'll get back to you very shortly. Please feel free to use this tool. They are an excellent resource. I also wanted to mention that we have all of our past recorded webinars available on our YouTube channel. If you go to video.servicetech.com or just go to YouTube and search for Service Technologies, you'll find all those recordings. Other than that, if you have more questions, please let us know. Thank you for sticking with us. I want to thank you for your time today. It's always a pleasure to see you all in the chat. I know I've met with a lot of you directly, so thanks for joining. We as a team are grateful for the work that you do throughout all of the different organizations and communities that you're serving and impacting. Partnering with you is one of the most satisfying aspects of our work. So again, if you have any questions from our content today or really anything else from your system, use that Need Help button when you're logged in or email support@servicetech.com. Thanks again for your time and hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday.